Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. And today what I'm going to show you is how you can very simply paint up late war British armour for Flames of War or anything that's going to be played in 15mm, and honestly some of these techniques work just fine at larger scales too. Now Battlefront very kindly sent along the Comets for me to have a play with, and they're looking forward to the upcoming Battle of the Bulge expansion. The Comet is an interesting vehicle in that respect, and I will talk a bit more about that later. But all of the paints will be listed in the description below for this one. Nice and quick, let's get started. So to start off with, once you've assembled your tank, the first thing to do is to prime it. And there's a couple of schools of thought here. If you want to go for the 100% accurate look, then something like Russian Uniform World War II from Vallejo is going to be quote-unquote the correct answer. It's what I would ordinarily use on my bolt action scale miniatures. But when it comes to Flames of War, 15mm stuff I find tends to look a little bit better when you make it slightly brighter. So instead here, I've primed this with Death Guard Green from Citadel. And we're going to stick to a lot of Citadel stuff today. Reason being, it's really easy to get your hands on in most cases. So once you have primed your tank, I'm going to put the turret aside, and with the caveat, of course, that anything I do to the hull here, I'll be doing to the turret as well. So our first step is actually going to be to apply a shade straight over the primer, and this is where I think Death Guard Green is super handy. What I've got here is a mixed pot. This is the old Agrax Earthshade, half and half with Lahmian medium. Would you need to do this with the new shade? I don't know, but you could use it straight from the pot and then dry brush Death Guard Green over the top as you need to. But all we're going to do is just bucket this on. You don't need to go crazy with it. But make sure that you are guiding it into the recesses. Any big flat clumps that develop, you can move those around with your brush, keep things nice and smooth. And then we'll let this dry, hopefully somewhere sunny, depends what your weather is like. But yeah, give this about half an hour to dry. Now it's important to let that dry for as long as it needs. If you do have any bits in the recesses that are still a little bit damp, then at this stage, things are going to be a disaster if it's wet. So let it dry. Can't stress that enough. At this stage, I actually really like that green. If you wanted to, you could get out your Death Guard Green or Russian uniform, if that's what you're wearing, and give it a quick overbrush over the top of that to leave the shading. But that green works fine. Yeah, that looks really good to me. We're going to move on though, and I have here Nurgling Green, which is one of the dry paints from Citadel. It is also available as a layer paint, which is useful to have, but for our purposes, we're not going to need that today. And then, holding your brush at an angle to the miniature, you can start picking out those hard edges and giving them a nice quick highlight. Looks a little more visually interesting from table distance here. You will need to go back and get some fresh paint intermittently, but you can be the judge of when you need to do that. As always, it's going to be way better to have too little paint on your brush and have to go over an area 2 or 3 times than have too much paint and just smear it everywhere. So, as always with dry brushing, take it easy at first, and over time, you'll get your eye in for how much you want to be doing. Now, one quick pointer, make sure when you come near the machine gun on the front, you slow down and take a little bit more time with how you apply it, because the last thing you want to do is go knocking off MGs at this stage, and I've done that more often than I'd care to admit. Now, just for effect, I've popped the turret on, and really that is the core of your late war British green. Whether you use the Russian uniform or Death Guard Green, Nurgling Green is still my go-to for a dry brush colour there. I think it adds plenty to the miniature. We can see clearly what all those details are from a distance, and it's quite nice. I like that. There's just a few details left to do, and the Comet does have this funky canvas cover over the front of the Mantlet, which we'll get to in a minute. But first, we've got some road wheels to paint. So for the rubber on the wheels, what I've got here is German Grey from Vallejo. Now I am using this instead of a Citadel colour, mostly because there isn't one quite like it in that range. This has got a very faint blue tint to it, which works super well for our rubber colour. But you could use Corvus Black here instead. So I'm now going to carefully paint the rubber sections. This is not the fun part, I'll tell you. Don't worry too much if you do hit the wheels you know, the suspension, and you sort of mess up the green a little bit, because as we do our weathering later on, most of those mistakes are pretty much going to be covered under the dust and weathering anyway. But it's good practice to take your time and try and get it right anyway. Let's come back in a few minutes. I'm also going to paint in the machine guns with this too. Sure, they're not rubber, but it's a close enough color, it's not going to matter at a distance. Theoretically, these return rollers should also have a rubberized coating, but no, I don't want to. The only other thing I've done is these tools on the side here, stuff that's going to be metallic later, just bop a little bit of that on there, it will look fine. What we're going to do now is some armor chipping, and what I've got is a tiny wee niblet of packing foam, which I've torn off, and we're going to fold that over a couple of times until we've got just a nice dense little nubbin. Now what I've got, this is a pair of tweezers that stays closed when you're not pinching them. Absolutely essential hobby purchase. If you find these anywhere, brilliant things to have, because now we've got our chipping brush. Here what I've got is Dryad bark. Now you could use instead Rhinox hide if you want. Just want a tiny wee little bit of this in our stippling brush, and then work most of it off onto a bit of paper or what have you. Then very gently just start dabbing along edges where you'd expect to see signs of wear and tear on the armor. Now, they do say sometimes less is more. I would say to you more is more, less is less, and sometimes less will look better. It is very easy to go overboard with this, so try not to. Just put it at arm's length occasionally, get a look at what you're actually doing. And it's worth pointing out, if you do have any decals that you're going to apply to your tank, put them on before you get to this stage. I don't have any, so I'm skipping that basically. After a couple of passes around the vehicle, you'll have something that looks like this, and I quite like how it turns out. I would suggest pay attention to areas where crew are going to be getting in and out of the vehicle, so anywhere where there's hatches, you know, a little extra to imply where they've been stepping or climbing out, but for the most part, just enough to make it look like it's seen a little bit of action, crashing through bushes and buildings and what have you. So one last touch for the chipping is to grab yourself a pencil. Something nice and soft. I've got here, this is a B. I do recommend a 2B if you can find it. What you do is just get the edge and lightly scuff along some of the markings that we've made to get a little silver chipping edge. And as well, check this out, you can use that to very quickly paint your metal details. You don't have to muck around getting out any extra paint for these. The more of the pencil that you apply, the fresher those dings and scrapes are going to look. It will show up a little better in reality, but you can still see some of that on the camera there. And like I said, less isn't more, but it might look better. So take your time, make sure to hold things at arm's length occasionally to get an impression of what you're doing. Now, if you want to be a little bit extra, what you can do is paint in some of the lamps. Get yourself a nice fine brush and some Fenrisian grey, which is a wonderful shade of blue, ironically. And especially these caged lamps at the front, you might find it a little difficult to paint a circle. Get in there as best you can. Don't worry if you can't get those edges perfectly, it won't matter too much. Then with some Ulthuan grey, we're going to paint a little crescent shape into roughly the bottom third of the lamp. The beautiful thing here is because we haven't really done anything else to it yet, if I apply too much, I can go back to my Fenrisian grey and just get rid of the excess. I'm not going to do this step on the lamps on the hull though. And then just a tiny wee dot of white at opposite sides of the lamp to make it look like we've got a little bit of light. When it comes to the ones on the hull, I'm just going to paint the top ding. So with some Mournfang brown, we'll just paint in the handles on the tools. Any boxes or other things you might have put on the miniature, just touch it in with a little bit of this now. We'll also use Mournfang brown to paint in the first stage of the tracks. Now I tend to find this easiest if you do it in two stages, which is to start off first of all by just jamming it all over the outside of the tracks. You can do this fairly quickly, and you're normally not too worried about hitting anything that you want to stay nice and clean. and then a smaller brush to do the in between the wheels, and let's flip it upside down, and I find this the easier way of getting to the undersides here. Now, the same as with our first shade, we need to let that dry thoroughly because we are going to dry brush over the top of it. I have here a little makeup brush, and honestly, the smaller the brush you can find for this, the easier it's going to be, and some Necron Compound. And what we'll do is just start lightly flicking along the tracks to catch those raised edges. I cannot speak today. If you do happen to dip in between and hit some of the track, it will not matter. It will actually look a little bit more realistic. So I'm now going to scooch along, just lightly flick along the edges of all of the tracks. Don't worry too much if you can't reach the links in between. It will not matter too much overall. Now, to catch the tracks that are coming over the return rollers, what I've got is a gnarly old synthetic brush, one that has really seen better days, but it's just pointy enough still that I can get in and add a little bit of Necron Compound there, so that section doesn't stand out quite so much. Before we get to the weathering, there is one last detail here that is unique to the Comet, and it's this canvas cover on the front of the mantlet here. Now, there was actually armor underneath. It wasn't just a big sock over the front of the tank, but it was designed that it would keep out dust and grime and protect the workings of the front of the gun. So, quite interesting. I've seen this painted up in a number of different ways, and I do like the canvas look, which contrasts a little more with the rest of the tank. So what I'm using, this is Zandri dust. If you wanted to go for a greener finish, then something like Deathworld Forest would be a very good choice here. Just take your time, go slow when you come near the tank itself. 2 coats later, you'll have a nice solid base for some more Agrax Earthshade. Now I'm going to use here the same mix that I did for the vehicle. Of course, if you're using the new Agrax Earthshade, it won't matter too much. Just get a little bit of shading in here, and that will look quite nice. And once that's dried, we'll use a little bit of Karak stone to highlight it. You don't need to add very much of this, just enough to catch the edges and make it look a little more three-dimensional. Now there we have very nearly our finished Comet, but I do want to add a little bit of dust and grime to make it look like it's been in the field for a little while. And there's a few ways you can do this. I'm just going to show you my favorite because it's probably one of the easiest. If you do want to apply some dirt or grime, like a textured surface to the miniature before you do this, something like Typhus Corrosion from Citadel is going to be a better choice than some of the larger mud. It's got a textured, grimy, gritty surface to it. Once you paint over the top of it, it will look much more in scale for dirt and grime collected on here. I'm not going to add it because I don't want it that dirty, but just a quick note on that. Your dust and grime works best added very gradually. So what I'm starting with is Steel Legion Drab and one of my oldest, softest brushes. What we'll do is once I've gotten most of that out of the brush is just to start sort of scrubbing. I'm not really stippling, I'm just going over the same area a few times, and it won't look like much at first. As a matter of fact, I might want some more paint on my brush, but it's important that instead of applying too much at first, like I said earlier, build up that color over time gradually. We want to sort of modulate, similarly to, well, similarly to as if we were using an airbrush. So you see if I scrub it a few times on the wheels, it builds up much more quickly. But take your time here and resist the urge to rush it. Right, this will look better if you add it gradually. Don't forget, flat areas also collect dust, so up on the tops of the flat panels, little scrubbing circular motions too. As much of this as you like. Now, I really can't stress enough, gradually build it up. So here's the side, and here is the rear where I haven't applied any yet. Take your time with this. Now, don't leave your turret completely clean. You do want to add a little bit there. It might not even show up on camera. Be subtle with it. What I've done is gone straight to Morghast bone, and I haven't actually cleaned out my brush before adding some of this in, and we're going to so lightly. Morghast bone is very bright. You could also use here a Shabti bone if you wanted to instead, But mind that you're very lightly applying this, because this one will quickly overpower what we've done. So concentrating on this one a little towards the top again, because here we want a settled dry dust kind of finish. So big flat panels. Again, slowly build it up and then hold your miniature out at arm's length occasionally to get a real look at what you're leaving behind. And of course, watch that MG. Now once you finish with that, your tank is pretty much complete. You can take it outside and hit it with a spray varnish. I would recommend doing that if you've applied decals, because you want to protect those. This fella, I'm not going to worry about it. All I'm going to do is add a little bit of ard coat to the lenses so that they shine just a bit more than the rest. And then let's get a look at what this looks like once that's dried. And there at last, our late war British armour is complete. So this is really simple, and I thoroughly enjoy spending that little bit of extra time slowly building up the colour at the end. All it is just patience, which is a hard one to try and teach as a technique, but it really will help you here. So once again, thanks very much to Battlefront for sending along the Comets here for me to have a bit of a play around with. As well, Exit 23 Games for all of my light and sound equipment, as well as the wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paint and glue, including my producers Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Andrew, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free to drop them in the old comment box below. My Twitter and Instagram are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.